So the other day I made a passing comment about a type of experimental racing car in Formula 1 that was powered slightly different to how we're used to, because instead of using an internal combustion engine, they went and tried something else. And no prizes for guessing who was involved, because when it came to absolutely insane ideas when it came to building racing cars, chances are that Colin Chapman and Lotus were involved, as they would push the boundaries of what was possible. Lotus had already changed the F1 landscape by adding wings to the Lotus 49, which generated downforce at the expense of drag and allowed for the cornering speeds to increase, which in turn made for faster lap times. That is, at least when the wings weren't breaking off the cars and then causing those cars to crash, which is what happened to both Graham Hill and Joachim Rindt at the same race in 1968 or 1969, but either way, Rindt had his nose broken. Whether that was the nose break that resulted in his characteristically misshapen nose that you see in photographs, I don't know. And it was stuff like this, on top of Lotus's just being fragile in general, that led Rindt to go up to Chapman and the other mechanics and say, if this happens again and I survive, I'll kill the lot of you. As fate would have it, Rindt would be killed at the 1970 Italian Grand Prix. The following year, Lotus turned up to the Italian Grand Prix under the name Worldwide Racing due to legal proceedings still ongoing with regards to Chapman and the team. But the car was not powered by its usual Ford V8 engine. This time, it was something totally different. Now, to say this was a Chapman idea isn't strictly true, because the story here goes back another few years when Lotus was an entrant in the Indy 500. Colin Chapman and Maurice Philippe had worked to design a car designated the 56. This was different to other Indy 500 cars of the time because it was a distinctive wedge shape rather than the typical cigar shape, and was designed to be as aerodynamic as possible, even if it did look like something out of Robot Wars. But like I said, this wasn't a brand new concept. In 1966, Ken Wallace had designed a car that was presented to two of America's racing pioneers, Dan Gurney and Carroll Shelby. And both Gurney and Shelby turned down the design, but the head of STP, Andy Granatelli, decided to take on this design instead. So why did Shelby and Gurney turn down this design? Well, it's because of the power plant. Instead of the usual internal combustion engine, it had a different type of engine altogether. A gas turbine engine. Now, I want to say a jet engine here, but it's not quite that cut and dry. Now, as shown here, the driver sat on the right hand side with this, and let's not beat around the bush here, helicopter engine next to him, and the whole thing was four-wheel drive. Because of the nature of the engine, it didn't need a gearbox. The driver just put his foot down and off it went. And it idled at 54% as well, so he could just coast up the pits. It qualified 6th for the 1967 Indy 500 and led 171 laps before breaking down. They entered it again in 1968, but it crashed on lap 1. Now, this was the year that Lotus brought the 56 to Indy, but it crashed in practice, killing Mike Spence, and USAC banned turbine engines and four-wheel drive systems from Indy thereafter. Now, ironically, Spence had replaced Jim Clark at Lotus following his death at Hockenheim in the April of that year. Replace one driver, and then a month later the replacement is killed. 1968 was a mad year. But gas turbine engines hadn't been outlawed in Formula 1, so Lotus brought the 56 to Formula 1, made it Formula 1 compatible, and still kept that Pratt & Whitney PT6 engine in the car, which, as I'll remind you, is a helicopter engine. Hi, it's Editing Aiden here. Just as a little bit of a pointer, the standard PT6 is a turboprop engine that's used on the Beechcraft King Air and Cessna Caravan, stuff like that. So the engine in the Lotus is closer to a helicopter engine than it is to the standard PT6. That's why I'm using helicopter engine as the catch-all term, because the engine in the Lotus is closer to that. Good. Anyway, back to the studio. Now, even though the PT6, first built by Pratt & Whitney in 1960, is a turboprop engine, they also have the B and C variant, which are turbo shaft engines, designed for use on helicopters. The exhaust gases turn a shaft and then that powers the transmission. At least that's how I understand it. Air is sucked into the compressor, compressed, fuel is added, the air combusts, and then the hot air is shot out from the compressor turbine to turn the free power turbine, which then turns the power shaft. This is the simpler way of putting it, as shown on the diagram here. And I'm sure there's engineering guys out there that will know every in and out, but this is Billy Basic stuff to just give you an idea. That free power turbine could be connected to some sort of cyclic gearbox. It could all be one unit, and so on. And in its construction, it's not unlike a jet engine. A jet engine generates thrust, while a turboshaft engine uses all of that internal combustion to create shaft power. So to say that this is a jet-powered F1 car is Well, it kind of explains the asterisk in the title of the video. So you might be thinking it produced an ungodly amount of horsepower. Well, actually, it didn't. While the standard PT6 would produce about 1000 horsepower, the one used by STP and Lotus was producing about 500 to 550 horsepower, because the engine they were using is used more on auxiliary power units or APUs on commercial jet aircraft. Basically, the APU spins a generator to generate power on the ground, and is that jet sounding noise an aircraft will make on the ground despite the engines under the wing not actually being fired up. So how did it get on in a competitive environment? Thanks to the four-wheel drive system, when the track was wet, the car was untouchable. The practice session at the 1971 Race of Champions was wet, and Emerson Fittipaldi was demolishing everybody but Stewart. But when the race came round, the car was exposed and it couldn't break out of the mid-pack. And being a Lotus, it retired within a few laps because something had broken on it. At the Dutch Grand Prix, it was pulled out again, and again ran well in the wet, before its driver, Dave Walker, slid off the road. At the British Grand Prix, it wasn't classified. The only race it finished was that Italian Grand Prix with the photo finish. But it finished 8th and a lap down. And I managed to find some bits online about how the car was driven. The engine weighed 3 ounces or 85 grams per horsepower, while the DFV was producing 340 grams per horsepower. The downside is that the engine response was awful versus the Cosworth. So the car had to be driven by basically keeping the throttle open and braking with just the brakes. In some cases, the driver would cut the throttle, brake, and then open the throttle up before the corner while riding the brakes to keep the speed down, and then release the brakes where all the power would take over. I guess it's a bit like this, but this is a bit overkill for what I'm trying to explain. Military jet, on the runway, throttle and afterburners at full tilt, but I'm on the brakes. Release the brakes, and off it f***s. At the start of a race, the car could have the fastest starts you've ever seen, if it wasn't so weighed down with fuel because it had to carry way more than everybody else. Engine power was something like 500 horsepower at 45,000 RPM. The DFV's peak output was 450 at around 11k. But on the plus side, the engine was very reliable, good for about 1,000 hours or so. So you could run one engine for a couple of seasons before you had to change it. At Brands Hatch, it's very possible that the car would have been at full throttle for the entire lap, maybe Zandvoort as well. If the car didn't have four-wheel drive, it would have been impossible to keep on the road, and because the car was on the brakes with no engine braking, the brakes overheated, and that caught Lotus out a few times in testing. And that wasn't the only safety concern. Like I said, the car needed to carry a lot more fuel than the other cars. It started the race with 62 gallons or 235 litres of fuel. I say fuel, kerosene. But the car wasn't a total write-off. It proved that aero was an important part of racing car construction in this era that F1 was transitioning into, and the wedge-shaped construction of the original IndyCar design became the Lotus 72, which would win 3 world championships and run until 1975 before Lotus changed up the cars. You'd also think that gas turbine engines were banned not long after this little experiment, but they weren't. They didn't get banned until 1982 when the team signed F1's first ever Concorde agreement, which also banned rotaries, diesels, and basically anything that wasn't a V-type, inline, or flat. Four-wheel drive wasn't banned until the following year, but it's another one of those mental experiments from back in the day that was just like an old Top Gear challenge. Ambitious, but rubbish. So then a look back to the time when Lotus entered with basically a jet engine, a helicopter engine, attached to their car. If this has been new and or interesting to you, then do like the video so it gets sent through the YouTube sphere. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and also get the Derek bell on so you never miss out on anything I do around here. Massive thanks to the patrons over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help out with the image buying or just keep things running around here, then a link to Patreon is in the description along with links to my F1 Store affiliate link, Discord, and also my socials. Well, there's super thanks down there too if you just want to do a one-off tip. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.